We are excited to welcome our next keynote speaker, Professor Paul Behrens, Associate Professor in Energy and Environmental Change at Leiden University. He will be speaking on the best of times, the worst of times, futures from the frontiers of climate science. Please welcome Professor Behrens.
Today, I'm going to be talking about the futures that we can expect from climate science. What we'll be talking about is some of the latest climate science, the development of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scenarios over time, and the findings of the different working groups. But before we sort of get onto that, let's just have a quick reminder of the trajectory. Now, if I show the trajectory here, this is extremely sharp reductions in emissions for 1.5 degrees. We actually have two lines here. We have a gray line, which is less steep, and a blue line, which is more steep. Now, the difference between these lines is that the gray line, the blue line, assumes that we'll be able to take out CO2 at the end of this century. Sorry, that's the gray line. So by going more slowly, we will assume that we'll be able to take out CO2 from the atmosphere, either artificially or through other carbon dioxide removal approaches. If we are to avoid having to do that to a great extent, we have to follow the blue line, which is extremely steep, of course. This is for 1.5 degrees, okay? Now, we talk about things in terms of degrees. I'll talk about what that means later on in the presentation, about what that means for society, because we talk about these temperature ranges and, well, actually, you know, what we're interested in is how this is going to impact society. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. For now, just to show you what this looks like visually, the longer that we delay getting to net zero, and you can see the line here coming to net zero, the more we have to remove of CO2 in the second half of the century. This is going to repeat one more time to show you. So as we're delaying net zero here, in the emissions reductions, we are getting more and more CO2 that we have to remove here. Now, as we move to about around 2070, 2060, if we delay until then, we will actually find that we are using continental or country scale deployments of negative emission technology. The equivalent of. So if we were to use bioenergy, carbon capture and storage to draw down the CO2 that we need in the second half of the century, because we delay so much now in the actual mitigation, then that means that we would need twice the area of the EU roughly twice the area of the EU in terms of the amount of land that we need to grow the trees, to take to the power stations, to put in power stations, and then to bury the CO2 underground. So this is a significant biodiversity threat, a significant water threat, lots of other different threats just by using the land in this way. Even if we were to use direct air capture, which some of you may have heard of, you're still talking twice the size of Ireland. So national sized installations to be able to draw down enough CO2. This is why we need to be limiting emissions as fast as possible today, so we can avoid having to rely on these technologies. The orange dotted line here are the national targets that we're currently at. So we're way off where we need to be in terms of the pace. An important point here is that this is for a 67% chance of 1.5 degrees. So this is actually for a less than Russian roulette chance of meeting the 1.5 degree target. I think there's broad consensus really that 1.5 is not going to be met. It would require something that is very, very hard to imagine. But we may be able to limit to 2 degrees, and even that's going to be quite difficult. For 1.5 degrees, we actually have a wide range of probabilities. So when you think about how much emissions that we have left for a specific temperature target, there's actually a lot more uncertainty than you might think. So this is from one of the best integrated approaches for a budget available in the literature. And what this shows here is the budget for a 1.5 degree limit. Now, you can see that the budget could be anywhere between right here on the left of this figure to the right of this figure. Now, the central case is around 440 gigatons of CO2. That was as of 2020. So that's about 10 to 12 years of current emissions, depending on how you calculate things, depending on uncertainties. And that's the central estimate here. But there's a significant part of the probability density function here that is actually below zero. So there's 15 to 20% chance that we've already exceeded the 1.5 degree limit from the emissions today. Now, this is possible. I mean, there's a likelihood of this. There's also a likelihood that we have more emissions to play with than we thought. So this is just something to show you in terms of the uncertainties that we're dealing with here. What's more likely going to be happening, of course, is that, you know, we'll push to 1.6, 1.7, try and limit it as far down as possible. So this is something that we need to bear in mind, that whenever you look at these mitigation pathways, you need to ask yourself, are we actually assuming that we will overshoot 1.5 degrees and then come back by the end of the century? Or are we assuming that we will meet 1.5 degrees and peak at 1.5 degrees, and that will be the peak at the end of the century? So we have to be really careful about whether we're talking about this sort of idea of cleaning up our mess in the second half of the century, or whether we're talking about significant mitigation impacts now that's going to reduce emissions and avoid having to use these technologies. So what does this mean? I mean, this means we have to be bracing ourselves for impacts. This is a fantastic website that I should encourage you all to go to when you can. This is a Carbon Brief. It's a online media newspaper. And what they do is collate the science and basically translate the science for the public and for policymakers. This is a map of all of the studies around the world that have used attribution methods for looking at extreme weather events. So what they've done is they've taken a model with and without anthropogenic climate change, and then looked at how much climate change has changed the prevalence, the severity of extreme weather events. So you range from things that are much more frequent to things that are much more serious. In some cases, it's hard to detect the signal. So you can see the gray ones here, but in general, you can see large amounts of impacts across the world. Now, these are only the papers that scientists have looked at. So this depends on scientific funding, scientific interest on different extreme weather events. So this is not the full picture, but if you go to this website, look at the place near you, a place near you, you can see exactly how climate change is impacting the extreme weather events that you're currently experiencing. And I think we've all seen enough in the past few years to be extremely concerned about how fast some of this is moving. And on that note, this is a figure that shows the different estimations in risk of what's called large-scale discontinuities over time from the third assessment report all the way up to the special report on 1.5 degrees more recently. Now, what this is saying is that the impacts that we thought we might see at about 5 degrees of warming, so things like loss of Arctic summer sea ice, some of the large-scale discontinuities in terms of forestry, we are actually systemically, or we did systemically underestimate how hot we needed to get to actually see these impacts. So for the same impacts that we thought we'd see at 5 degrees in the past, we now think will happen within 2 degrees. This is why this is so very concerning, is that some of these large-scale systems, climate systems, can be destabilized at a much lower temperature than we previously thought. I should say that scientists have done a fantastic job in estimating the total temperature that we would expect for a certain amount of emissions, but the way in which the energy sort of changes in the system and the way in which the climate responds to those temperatures has been underestimated in general. We've seen this in terms of the scale of floods in Germany. We're seeing this in terms of food systems and concerns on this. And you might think to yourself, you know, well, how is it that we're unable to really get a good handle on how these big systems can change? And I've got a video here to show you how this can be the case. So if we take an example of the Canadian boreal forests, so these are temperate forests, we see them also in Siberia, you see the spread of pests. As things are warming up, they're moving further north, they're eating through the trees. You can see the grey trees here. This is then adding fuel to wildfires. Lightning strikes are moving further north because of climate change too, and we're seeing more and more wildfires, not just in Canadian boreal forests, but in Siberia, in Scandinavia, other regions like this. And you can kind of get in it, you can kind of see why that's very difficult to model. You're talking about biology, you're talking about climatology, you're talking about meteorology with the lightning strikes there. These are very complex systems, which are really tricky to get a full handle on for how quickly they may be able to change state. This is a map from a now sort of fairly famous hothouse Earth paper. This is where they attempted to survey the different tipping elements at risk. So what big systems, what might we see possibly change into a completely different state and be very difficult to recover from? Okay, so if I look at 1 to 3 degrees of warming, then suddenly these systems appear. Now, these are the sorts of systems we would expect to destabilize in that temperature range. Scientists already think that the Greenland ice sheet, for example, is already beyond the point of no return. This is still fairly uncertain because the tipping element might be somewhere in the order of sort of decades to actually sort of be able to tell. But yeah, there's reasonable confidence that it's beyond the point of no return. The thing we have to be careful of say here is that this is not the tipping point dynamic of a riot or an internet meme. This is a tipping element. So this will take centuries, perhaps even 1,000 years to fully unfold. So we'll have some time to respond to the rising sea levels from the Greenland ice loss. But these are quite connected because as we see that one system is changing, it can have knock-on effects to the other system. So for example, if we lose Arctic summer sea ice, so our temperatures are hotter over the Arctic during the summers. We see less recovery of the sea ice during the winters because of warmer temperatures then. Then that area is going to move from that white, which is going to be reflecting away that heat, to the dark blue of the ocean. We're going to be absorbing more heat. So that's going to be driving more heat retention around Greenland, driving more ice sheet loss, driving more sea level rise. So there are connections between these. If I move now from 3 degrees to 5 degrees, now we're moving up to another set of tipping elements that could kick in. Okay, we saw, I already spoke about the boreal forest earlier, maybe some underestimations of how fast that could move. And these are also interconnected as well. So the Greenland ice sheet loss can influence the currents in the Arctic, can have impacts in the Amazon rainforest. These are quite interactive. Now, there's a small, a limited probability that all of these are lined up behind one another, and that one will hit another, will hit another, will hit another. That's a possibility, and that possibility increases the warmer we get. So some scientists like to say, above 2 degrees, then you're getting into sort of danger territory. Some other scientists are suggesting actually there's so much that we don't know that even this really small risk of this happening now is something we should be really, really careful and fearful of. This is an intentionally overwhelming slide. This is a paper that looked at the societal impacts of climate change. So what they did is they surveyed the broad threat to humanity from these cumulative climate hazards. So how can these hazards connect together to make life very difficult for us around the world? They found over 400 different ways that we could find impacts on this. And just to zoom in to a few examples here. First of all, if you think about water scarcity, that's going to affect food shortages. That's going to affect the availability of food, which is going to result in malnutrition. If you're suffering from malnutrition, then often your immune system is not as strong. Diseases are also spreading more rapidly in climate change. And so then we see this nasty vicious cycle where we see more disease spread. And of course, increases in food prices and also malnutrition, also disease spread is going to result in migration, displacement. Through that, it's well documented that we get more conflict, more violence and destabilization. You don't need much in terms of increase in food prices in order to spark political destabilization. We saw that during the 2007 food crises. And we saw a lot of destabilization in especially middle income nations such as Mexico. In terms of food systems, this is one that I think we should be extremely cognizant of. Papers are showing that the climate signal on the food system is coming earlier than we previously thought. So if we underestimated how fast the natural systems could change, we overestimated the resilience of society. And this came out quite clearly in the recent Working Group 3 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which looked at, the Working Group 2 report, which looked at adaptation and vulnerabilities. And they said, again, that we are less resilient than we thought. Now, if we have a look more recently at some examples of this, we've seen heavy flooding in the US, we've seen droughts in Punjab's food basket regions. Some studies are suggesting that the possibility of multiple extreme events hitting major food producing regions at the same time in the same year is going to be going up with increasing temperatures. Maize or corn, which is the most sensitive crop to some of these changes may see increased chances of these multi-breadbasket failures, going from 1 every 16 years historically to 1 every 3 years at 1.5 degrees and 1 every 2 years at 2 degrees. So these are significant increases in the likelihood of extreme events hitting major food producing regions at once. Now, we can already see some of the impacts of climate change on, for example, recent harvests. China, for example, has recently posted severe warnings about their wheat harvests. This is driven by heavy rains. I don't know that there's been an attribution study that those heavy rains are due to climate change, because we would expect some level of extreme weather events without climate change, of course. But you know, the severity and the frequency of these events are increasing due to climate change. To some extent, we're already seeing the impacts of climate on food insecurity. This is the global food insecurity over time. And you can see in previous years, we've actually been seeing a reduction in food insecurity, but as we reach the present, it's actually starting to stagnate and go up again. Now, the FAO suggests that more recently this big spike is due to COVID, but the climate has actually led to part of this increase over time as well. So on the sort of edges of society, those who are most precarious, those who are poorest, those who are unable to have the resources to be resilient, these people are already suffering. And this is the warning signal that we would expect to see in a complex system. It would be the people who are most precarious that would be in the worst shape. So we've been seeing a lot of plots, and I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't actually show what this means for humans on the ground. Wildfires in California, flooding in Germany, Belgium, India, even well-resourced nations struggling to cope with the impacts of climate change. And I think we have to start internalizing why this is an emergency, or why this is so serious, why we have already seen so much damage, that we will continue to see damage the longer that we emit, and that even as we bring down the emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere each year, things will continue to get worse. So these years that you see here, these are the best that we can expect for in the future, until we get to net zero and start to drive down those emissions. Okay, so I'm sorry to do this, but this is where it really hits you. Okay, now the key thing here is that even though it's late in the day, and this might come as a complete surprise, there is still huge hope for rapid transitions. And some of these transitions are going much faster than anybody thought. The energy transition is moving faster than energy analysts thought. The food transition, I think, will be moving faster than food systems analysts think. And the economic transition, I think, will come as part of these other transitions. So how can these sorts of different transitions contribute to really driving down these emissions? Let's have a look at the energy transition. The energy transition is basically mostly figured out, I have to say. We electrify almost everything because electricity is clean. We can do it cheaply with wind and solar, and we can already electrify about 70% cheaply. There will be room for hydro, there will be room for geothermal, there'll perhaps in the longer term, be some room for nuclear, at least keeping some nuclear running, but we don't necessarily need it because we've got solar, wind, short-term storage, and we've got some other solutions I'll talk about in a moment. But the main thing is that we can already electrify about 70% cheaply. Electrical systems are so much more efficient than fossil fuel driven systems. The moment you move from a petrol vehicle to an electric vehicle, you actually improve the efficiencies about 3 times. Now, that's the same for putting a heat pump in a house. So we can do it very cheaply and efficiently. This is a figure of what's left over in terms of the difficult areas to decarbonize, and that's the areas that are sticking out in the pie chart here. So we're seeing aviation, shipping, load following electricity. So this is electricity between seasons, especially. So how do you store the renewable energy that you have during the summer, say, through solar, to warm houses during the winter? That's actually quite tough. And different process emissions in terms of cement. So we have emissions from cement, and also some of the heat, the high heat that's required in iron and steel production, which is difficult to produce using electricity. But we're talking about sort of 30% or so. Thing is, the faster that we go on this, the easier this is getting as well. Now, this is called deep decarbonisation, and here we could use technologies like hydrogen. We can use things like synthetic fuels. This would be where we produce hydrogen from water, combine that with carbon dioxide captured from the atmosphere even, or other waste streams, and then produce synthetic fuels, and even electricity in high temperature processes. So that even that's getting easier than we thought. One of the main messages here is that things are getting cheaper and easier than we thought. If we have a look at renewable energy, I'm sure, given your interests, you'll already know this, that wind and solar have come dramatically down in cost. In fact, they're beating gas and coal now in terms of price. In fact, this is an interesting report from McKinsey, and what they found was that new renewables are already cheaper than existing gas and coal in many areas of the world already. So it is cheaper to buy the panels, turbines, pay to install them, buy the land, than to continue to put another bit of coal in a coal power station. That's remarkable. I mean, that completely changes what's possible. And if we see the same growth rates that we've seen in wind and solar, and we were able to keep that going around the world, then we could decarbonize much faster than I think previous energy analysts thought. A lot of the issues about storage and things are actually not looking as hard as we thought either. Batteries have come down a lot in costs. We've got other demand side management techniques. Most of the modeling studies show that this is entirely possible and it's not that expensive. However, if we have this energy transition and we complete this energy transition, the food transition on its own would be enough to push us beyond 1.5 degrees and even up towards 2 degrees. Here we have the agricultural emissions in 2050 if we carry on today. This is the baseline. So this is where we would be if we carry on today. This is a 75% reduction that we would need by 2050 in order to avoid some of these tipping elements, some of these issues. So the food transition is basically made up of three main things. It's made up of dietary change, it's made up of reducing food waste, and it's improving production. Now, I'm sure many of you already know that we're going to need some dietary change here. Now, what you may not know is that this is easily the largest factor in all of the studies that look on food systems overall. Any single study that you look at, plant-rich diets is always the largest opportunity that we have. Reducing food waste is also a very big one as well. And actually the improvement in production is not as much of an opportunity as you might think. Closing yield gaps does make a difference, but it just does not make as much of a difference as these huge impacts that animal agriculture have on the planet and on the climate. Now, in our research recently, we had a look at what would happen if you use the land that you saved from the shift to plant-based diets to draw down carbon. And that's because 80% of agricultural land is used for animal agriculture. So there's a huge amount of land. So we had a look at what would happen if you had a switch to a planetary diet in high-income nations. And in high-income nations alone, you'd save an area the size of the EU, and you'd be able to draw down an equivalent of about 90 gigatons of carbon by the end of this century by letting that land that you saved by switching to plant-based diets go back to nature, go back to the potential natural vegetation, as we call it. What that means is you basically double the opportunity of your direct emissions from changing to plants by having all of this sequestration upstream later on as well. Now, I like to think about this not in terms of just climate, but also biodiversity. If we have a look at this video, this is pasture. It's basically a biological wasteland. It's a desert. I mean, very, very, let me just go back there 1 second. Very, very low biodiversity, poor soil management. It depends where you are. Sometimes it can be better. If you then manage to save that land and revert it to nature, this is what it looks like. Look at the amount of carbon that's being stored here. Look at the biodiversity, the cleaner water. Look at the access to nature. We know that humans are very happy and they lower their stress when they get access to nature. So we have all of these sort of visions. So what we need is a real systems vision that connects the producer and the consumer. So how are we going to make sure that farmers are kept happy during this transition, whilst consumers make this change in their diets, in their food waste, in maybe some of the production systems. So we need this new food contract. Whether all of this is possible, when we look at a lot of these changes in diets and especially in society, we're talking about social tipping points. And this is empirical data showing how, as the size of a committed minority increases, it can flip the convention that's adopted in the wider group. So what's happening here is as you move up to 10% of the committed minority, 20% of the committed minority, suddenly the rest of the group, because of social convention, take on those habits. This has been popularized many times, tipping point, of course, these sorts of ideas. But this empirical data seems to suggest that anywhere between 15 and 40% of the population is required for a big shift. And to put that in perspective, plant-based diets are already sort of around 10%, depending on which country you're talking about, 5 to 10%, depending on the country. When we see these tipping points, we also sort of have to look at civil action. Civil action is having a large impact worldwide in bringing the salience of the issue up, putting it on politicians' tables. As soon as the Extinction Rebellion activities a few years ago came in, many countries declared a climate emergency. Now, whether you say, okay, they declared a climate emergency, but they haven't done anything about it, yeah, you can be cynical about that, of course. But one was directly a consequence of the other, because especially in the UK, a month after these protests, there was a climate emergency declared. So this is an important pressure point in society, and I think mostly the public are far beyond where the politicians are, who are generally far beyond where the businesses are, which are generally beyond where global finance and perhaps even geopolitical concerns are. And the reason why I say that is because when you actually ask the public what they would like to do about climate change in citizens' assemblies, they mention things that are off the table politically. So things like banning SUVs, frequent flyer taxes, cutting down meat, or at least suggestions to cut down meat. So in the UK, they asked 108 people from around the country to come to learn about climate change and to ask them what they would like to do. This is from all areas of life. So these are not 108 scientists or even 108 sort of necessarily interested people. These were selected people from all walks of life, and they came up with these suggestions, which were far beyond, as I say, where the politics is at of the day. Another important positive or beneficial feedback is the number of climate cases, so the legal litigation of climate around the world. And the reason why this is a really important feedback is because as you discover more documents during the discovery phase of litigation, this can be used by other litigants to bring more cases against more companies. And we're starting to see a tipping points in finance, for example, the changing in the ability for banks to leverage in terms of loans, if they're lending to highly carbon exposed sectors. There are some changes, but I think this has been fairly slow so far. So the biggest things you can do, just to talk very briefly about this, don't sweat the small stuff. I hear a lot of people worrying about where their tomatoes are coming from. Should they come from here or here? I mean, if you're eating tomatoes and not steak, it's already great. Focus on the big things. The big things are changes in transportation, trains, depending on where you live, electric bikes, especially electric cars, if you must have a car, changes in diets, vegetarian diets, plant-based diets, introducing insulation. It's often the boring stuff that actually has the biggest impact. Don't be purist. I always say take small steps and then reevaluate as you go. Things get easier as you go. They certainly have for me, because I'm not naturally a vegan or anything. I ate a lot of meat when I was younger, but making smaller steps really helped the next step become easier and easier. And this is a systems transition. So as the world changes around you, it makes it easier to engage in it. Do talk about it. Talk to other people while you're making these changes, why you think they're important, because the social contagion is the systems change. Individuals are made up of, systems are made up of individuals, but individuals have to operate within the system. And so it's this constant interaction between the two of them that's important. And internalize what the science says. I mean, once you start to feel the things that I showed you earlier in this presentation, you start to say, okay, like how can I take this faster? How can I be faster about this? How can I use everything in my life towards this goal of reducing these emissions and reducing these harms? And just a final slide here. These rapid transitions, we do have these beneficial feedbacks, and this leads to these system shifts. So in terms of technology, we have, the faster the investments pour in, the faster the costs come down, and the faster the better technologies out can be. And we've seen this with solar and wind, which are more like smartphones rather than power stations. In society, the faster we make small steps, the further steps come easier, the faster change becomes. And we see this when, for example, we have more plant-based options on the menu. Meat eaters engage in those. Research shows this. And civil actions, more lawsuits, more discovery, the faster change becomes. So I'll leave it there. If you there's a lot to cover, if you'd like to read a little bit more, my book is here and it comes with all the references. I think there's quite too many references probably, but thank you very much. And if you have any questions, Florian, please feel free to ask.
Excellent. We thank you, Professor Behrens, and please give him a round of virtual applause. Now, please join our next panel on climate policy and initiatives.